This time, a virtual travel films crew traveled to the most contaminated and dangerous radioactive area of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. The place is called the Red Forest. Even 35 years after the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, this area of the Chernobyl zone remains one of the most contaminated and radioactive places on the planet. We will be exploring this radionuclide contaminated site, together with scientists, to find out how nature is recovering from the terrible radiation environmental disaster in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. We are near the burial grounds where the radioactive forest trees were buried. During the response to the accident, most of the pines were bulldozed and buried in trenches. The forest was buried in these burial sites. And not only the radioactive forest, but also the forest litter and the entire topsoil. There are more than 800 such burial grounds here. Generally speaking, decontamination was carried out on an area of nearly 15 square kilometers. Special military equipment was used for this. For this work, special troops were involved. A lot of people, a lot of military personnel were involved to bury this radioactive red forest. The Red Forest is an area of 10 square kilometers, 4 square miles, surrounding the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the exclusion zone. The site is located to the west of the nuclear power plant. The name Red Forest comes from the reddish-brown color of the pines after they died as a result of absorption of high levels of ionising radiation as a result of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster on April 26, 1986. The pine forest absorbed huge doses of radioactive dust through its treetops. For all living organisms living there, the radiation was deadly. The radiation literally scorched out life, turning century-old pine trees into desiccated red skeletons. The explosion and fire at the Chernobyl No. 4 reactor contaminated the soil, water, and atmosphere with up to 20 times more radioactive matter than the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's 90, 100 microröntgen. Wow, 150 microröntgen. Here, 160 microröntgen. That's about 10 times more than outside the Chernobyl zone. The dead dry forest was very radioactive. This dry forest could have caught fire at any time, which would have led to a new release of large amounts of harmful substances into the atmosphere. Therefore, it was decided to eliminate the dead dry forest. To decontaminate the area, the dead wood was buried in 1987 in special trenches. A thick layer of sand with a height of 3 meters and a total length of about 4 kilometers was poured on top of these trenches. Then, these radioactive burial grounds were planted with pine seedlings. Liquidators felled dry radioactive trees, raked up the contaminated topsoil, and placed it in specially dug trenches. For this purpose, special military equipment designed to work in conditions of intense radioactive contamination was used. At this burial site, the radiation background is 100 to 200 microrengens per hour. After decontamination, radiation levels have dropped significantly. But there are radioactive organic substances inside the burial site, such as wood, forest litter, radioactive humus layer of soil are all good substrates for plant development. You can see that both woody plants, bushes, and various herbaceous plants grow on the surface of the burial ground. These plants are brought from the burial ground, from the body of the burial ground, to the surface. This is secondary biogenic migration. But in case of fires, it is an additional source of contamination and transfer of radionuclides to the adjoining territories. However, not all areas of the Red Forest have been buried in burial sites. This area of the Red Forest that we are now in has not been decontaminated and buried. It is an area of complete mortality of conifers. Nowadays, 35 years after the accident, radiation levels here are very high. According to scientists' calculations, radiation dose levels in 1986 to 1987 were between 8,000 and 10,000 rads. In this area, the pines died completely and the needles turned red. All the trees were practically burnt out from the radiation. They accumulated significant amounts of radioactive emissions. The remains of unburied radioactive trees lie everywhere. These skeletons of trees are still very radioactive today and pose a danger to human health and life. Here, science encountered a new type of radioactive fallout. It turned out that so-called hot particles were present as part of the Chernobyl radioactive dust. These are high-activity particles from a nuclear reactor. At the time of the explosion, the temperature of the nuclear reactor reached several thousand degrees. The nuclear fuel particles were fused and mixed with other chemical elements of which the reactor was built. Scientists have found particles with transuranic elements, which, unlike the rest, are extremely difficult to wash off by rain from the surface of the earth and plants. In February 2022, during the Russian aggression against Ukraine, Russian troops were moving through the Red Forest. Long military convoys raised clouds of radioactive dust. Nuclear plant workers reported that the Russian occupiers did not use protective suits and put their health at risk. On March 31, 2022, most of the Russian troops occupying Chernobyl were forced to retreat because of radiation sickness among soldiers and officers. Russian troops dug trenches in the heavily contaminated Red Forest. On April 1, 2022, the Daily Telegraph reported the death of one Russian soldier from acute radiation sickness after a long stay in a camp in the Red Forest. In October 2022, CNN reported that Russian soldiers stationed at Chernobyl were treated in Belarus. Many of the soldiers showed signs of radiation exposure. Although the Red Forest remains the most contaminated area in the world, years later life has returned to the area. The radiation situation here has improved considerably, and this has allowed new life to settle in the area. Today, it is a habitat for many plant and animal species. New life is breaking out of the forest floor, young oak sprouts. Radiation has greatly affected the flora and fauna of the Red Forest. The pine trees here were the basis of the entire food pyramid chain. The death of the pine trees led to the death and disappearance of pests that ate the needles. This, in turn, led to the extinction of many bird species. Large amounts of radioactive substances have accumulated in the surface soil layer, resulting in high levels of radiation exposure. Because of this, ants and other predatory insects disappeared from the forest floor. More than 90% of the radioactivity in the red forest was concentrated in the soil. The highest levels of cesium-137 were found in surface soil layers. From the soil, the radionuclides are absorbed by the plants and insects living there today. Nowadays, the area of the red forest has become a radiological nature reserve. Nature has not only been preserved here, but it has flourished thanks to a significant reduction in human impact. In addition to insects, storks, wolves, wild boars, beavers, deer and eagles are found here again. Studies showed that burying the radioactive forest did not solve the problem but, on the contrary, worsened the ecological situation. 2 years after the burial of the radioactive trees, the presence of radionuclides was detected in the groundwater near the trenches where the burial took place. At present, the burial sites of the radioactive forest are sources of radioactive substances in the groundwater of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone.